So, yes, I thought it'd be easy to introduce my friend Khuram, but I miss you, but I won't go into that. But a great friend, a great colleague at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, I believe for about 14 years, you were with us. Professor, amazing professor in the Department of Education, Dean of Hobart College, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and right now in California, but currently in Middlebury College, also as a Vice President for Equity and Inclusion. And so welcome, Khuram. Welcome to everybody by Zoom and in the library, and to the coalition for putting this amazing program together. So I just say that. And I'd like, just as part of my little introduction, more than me, I want the voice of a student, because you touched so many of the students. This was the editorial of the Herald, the student newspaper at the colleges. And this is what Amy Freeman, the editor-in-chief, said when you left last summer. His guidance and care have touched hundreds of students, faculty, and staff here at HWS. His absence will be felt on a deep level after his departure this summer, but the wisdom and encouragement that he has left behind will live on in our community. And if I may add, the Geneva community as well. And, and we will be talking a little bit about the impact of students, higher education, the changes in higher education, but we'll leave that towards the end, right? And so just for our audience, I just wanted to review a few of the ideas, concepts that we'd like to kind of have a conversation on, but please feel free, as Alex said, anything that comes up, it's really more than a dialogue, it's really a group conversation, right? And we want to build community as we talk and grow and learn from each other. So we'll be talking, we'll be touching on Asian American, what we mean by that label, and what are sorry, my cat is in the background making noise, but sorry about that. When we have labels such as do they hinder understanding? Understanding or acceptance of members of groups, that we put under certain labels. The model minority phenomenon, right? Stereotypes, positive, negative around that. This, the pandemic, the impact it had on how especially our East Asian friends were affected by that, and parallelisms with 9/11. And then about you growing up in, if I may go back to where you came from, right, to America, right, the experiences of as a Pakistani American, and yes, the burden of that, but also the beauty of that as well, right, and how to negotiate the journey. And so we'll start from there. So if you want to start with, Asian American, right? And I think it was Toni Morrison who said that you have white privilege and that the rest of us are hyphenated, right? And so, if you're not that, you're hyphenated. So here we are, it's hyphenated. What are your thoughts, Khuram, right? Do these labels hinder? Do they open up acceptance? Go, my friend.
Do they hinder or do they open up acceptance? Yes. It's funny because, a lot of times when we talk about identity and identity politics, we're often prone to forget that these were originally, the original identity politics were the politics of whiteness. And so all of the other identities that have been constructed around that. And so we inherited a system of otherness, of difference, of not belonging as being built into the society. And now today we have communities that want to get in the driver's seat and be able to say something about their identities, so that these identities don't just happen to us, but we can say something about them, and we can do something with them, and we can do something meaningful. So to me, it really is either or, right? We can allow this identity to be kind of projected upon us, and then we are told what it means and who is and isn't Asian American, or we can make choices. We can make intentional, deliberate choices, and we can learn from other communities that Toni Morrison would connect herself with, right? And I mean community in a lot of ways here, but ways of saying, this is how I want to see Asian American, because this is how I want to be in community, with others. And so I'll say just that for now, that it not like that sort of academic thing where you always say it depends. Like when someone asks you a question, well, it depends. Not that. I mean something. What I mean is we have a choice. We get to make choices about who we are going to work to be in community with. And so, for instance, what does it mean to be South Asian and Asian American? What does it mean to be East Asian in heritage and origin, and to be Asian American? So those are contested, and they happen through dialogue and through shared work. So that's a big, broad way that I want to just open that up to say, yes, it could be either, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way connected to that, another label that I think has kind of been placed upon Asian American community, the South Asian, Southeast Asian community, is the model minority phenomenon, right? And that's in academia, we use it quite a bit. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of that, and I know that the book kind of really went into that. But give us a sense of that, right? And I guess connected with what Wash Ali said in his book. You know, at some point, I think we had this conversation, Khuram. I remember that when you were, I think, in college, you said that you would go into the room and they would always say, "Oh, are you here to help us with technology? Right? Are you the techie today?" So that's kind of in a way connected to this model minority and the well-behaved members of the model minority and the impact that has on other minorities, right? For the benefit of
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And so I'm just curious, for those that are on camera, just raise of hands if you can. Who's heard the term? Who's familiar with the term? I won't quiz you. Okay. All right, great. Okay. And so I won't go into like a kind of a definition of it, but I will share a little bit about how it's lived in the places and spaces I've been a part of. You know, the sort of the history of it is kind of about separating different minoritized communities. It comes from a journalist who sort of, you know, coins the phrase as an effort to say, why can't these oppressed communities just work harder like these oppressed communities, right? And then they can achieve the American dream. And I think on some level, I understand at a very core level why someone would want to benefit from the advantage of being seen as better than, right, some other group in a society where you're constantly told that you are less than, in small and everyday and sometimes really big ways, depending on if we hit a big moment of crisis. And so I think that it's helpful to be able to use as a survival kind of tactic to sort of buy into it. And yet it doesn't feel, something about it doesn't feel right. And we all know that something about it doesn't feel right. You know, I'll never forget this conversation. I was in California. I was talking to this South Asian man, Pakistani American, and he's like, you know, we're Aryan, right? And I was like, what? He said, you know, we're Aryan. South Asians, we're Aryan. We come from Aryan stock. And, you know, these are all kind of European racial categories, right, that they created. And you know, there's this Euro-Asian kind of Aryan kind of category. And this is why, like, you know, the Third Reich borrowed the swastika from like Indian, you know, civilizations of you know, ancient times as sort of like their symbol as sort of Aryan. So it's really disturbing that this person's like saying this, but you know, it was coupled with all this really anti-Black bigotry. Like, you know, where all my friends are white and I don't associate with those people. They're not hardworking. They're not safe. They're dangerous. All these, you know, really ugly stereotypes and narratives about Black communities. And I felt, first I was just like, ew, right? But I was also, I felt really sad. I really felt badly for this person who was so disconnected from the world around them and was trying to live in a fantasy, right? We know the history of these efforts to use this language of Aryan to associate with whiteness. The Sikh American at the turn of the century that took a case to the Supreme Court in an effort to be seen as white, because at the time only a person deemed to be white could own property in California, and he was a farmer. He wanted to own property. He took his case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, on the face of it, yes, technically, you are Aryan, but essentially, we don't think you are because you don't look the way that we would want you to. And the only real measure of who gets to be white is what a white man says is white. And so they denied his case. He, in the months after, fell into a deep malaise and ultimately committed suicide. And I think it was a moment where, I think South Asians became a part of other kinds of racial categories in America. And that keeps happening. People keep telling us who we are, right? And who we are not. And so I think that the model minority narrative was an opportunity for others, again, to tell us who we are, not because they really cared about like our well-being, but because they wanted to actually demonize Black and Latinx, Latina communities, right? That's what that was, I think, really about. Mm-hmm. And so I think about, yes, in the short term, maybe it makes us look a little better, like we're the IT person, right? And so that's a different kind of violence. It's a little bit more subtle, even a kind of a funny thing, right? But ultimately, it leaves us in a place where we can't actually experience our own humanity, right? For so many reasons, right? I mean, how many Asian Americans, how many of my uncles and family members have suppressed and hidden the everyday humiliations, the things yelled out of trucks, the things said to them in encounters, the promotions they couldn't get, the fact that no matter how much education they got, right? I remember sitting with a room full of Pakistani American doctors, and not one of them, regardless of their experience and expertise, sat on the board for their hospitals. Not one of them had a position of leadership outside of where they started from. And so again and again, there are all these ways in which we have repressed acknowledging the hurt, the pain, the humiliation, watching the indignities that our fathers go through, that our mothers go through, when people twist their faces and look at them, and the things they whisper and say, and the things they won't invite them to, right? And yet we have before us this rich community, this vibrant community of Black and Latino and Latina and Latinx liberation artists that have learned that to sit in the pain, to name the oppression, is the first step in our liberation. And so I think about what's at stake for us, both personally and as a community, by living in this model minority mythology, which still exists to some degree, and that people are willing to throw away after 9/11, after a global pandemic. They're willing to throw away those model minority myths, and then we become the other. And we are reminded in more aggressive terms that we are under systems of racist oppression. And that's where I also have hope, because even the term person of color, right? Who's heard the term person of color? Who's used the term person of color? Where does it come from? It comes from Asian women, Asian American women, and Black American women working in labor solidarity together. And they weren't sure what to call themselves. And they're like, we can't call ourselves Black women. We can't call ourselves Asian women. We are both. We are women of color. So even that language is given to us through people that refused, rejected the seductive and ultimately poisonous pill of model minority identity in favor of liberation, in the favor of community, and in favor of a kind of identity that's always evolving. That's why I can't answer the question about who's Asian American. We have to decide. We have to make the decision, and we make it together. And we have to remember, we have to tell these stories. We have to remember how we have freed others, even if they don't identify as us, and how we've been freed by others, even if we don't identify with them.
So, well, thank you, Khuram. Wow, yeah, it's yes, as our author said, right? The proximity to whiteness, in a way, it's also the other side of the distancing from Blackness, right? And in the hope, and then we'll come back to hope, because I know you're a great advocate of us Wash Ali will also be investing in hope, right? Despite everything. So you did allude, my friend, to a moment of crisis, the pandemic, 9/11, and how, all of a sudden, people become the other, right? When it's convenient, and it's always ruled, by those who rule, who we're allowed to rule. So, and you did talk. I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about your life in terms of, right, the experiences of misunderstandings between Pakistani and Indian background. The expectations that members of the Asian American community, there's certain professions that are perceived, that many times also come from our own communities ourselves, right? And so there's sometimes this give and take of what's coming from outside, but in a way, as we adapt, the dangers, right, the risks of adapting, of assimilating, right? And that many times I think of my parents and probably your parents, right? And it's like different context, but it's the practicality of just be part of the dream, just live your life in America, right? And the tensions that can cause as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you mentioned Wajahat Ali, like, who gets to participate in their own authentic self, right? And so, like, it's like he kind of says, the left doesn't want us if we're too religious. The right doesn't want us because we're not the right religion. And so it's like, we don't have a home. So even when we share deep, enduring values with different, areas of political life in America, we don't get to see ourselves as having a full sense of belonging. So we're having to give up some important part of ourselves. And so when we talk about assimilation, one of the really sort of powerful pieces of assimilation is that it demands that we kill or repress some very important part of ourselves. Part of what makes us who we are, where we've come from, the things we honor, the things that we remember in our dreams and in our waking moments, and some of our greatest, contributions to our families, to ourselves, to our communities. We're asked to kill those things, to cut those branches down, and not be ourselves, and at the price of an entire society too, because when you have people that can't be themselves, then they have to sort of mimic, and that the emptiness of that and the inauthenticity of that keeps all of us from being a little bit more free and a little bit more open and a little bit more suspicious of one another, right? Why can't I have a long beard and wear a kufi and vote for Bernie Sanders? Why can't I, be a secular, libertarian who also believes in like the power of community and social programs that are valued to different communities on different terms? Why can't I live the life that a white person lives in that sense, not in assimilating to white identity, but to the kinds of diverse experiences that a person gets to have politically, and culturally and religiously. And so I think that for me, just what is at stake with not getting, multiculturalism right, inclusion right, is that we will ultimately have an inauthentic we won't be a multicultural democracy. We'll be multiple cultures living under one culture that keeps pretending that it's a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there was another part to your question. I don't want to lose that.
No, I think the internal, sometimes the internally what happens in communities or in families, but I think that you addressed that, right, of the having to push aside, who we are for, in the name of assimilating or leaning towards whiteness. So
I appreciate both the empathy and the curiosity underneath that question. And, I think that something that I'll name only because I would have gone my entire life not noticing, because there's so many ways in which being othered is even invisible to the person being othered. I was overlooked. And I'm saying this in retrospect because I didn't even know I was being overlooked. I was overlooked for my entire academic career as an educator, as someone who had potential to be a school leader, to have leadership qualities, until we had our first Black president. And he heard me speak, and I was speaking as a teacher about a community service project, and I was speaking to some board of trustee members, and I spoke, and I walked out of the room because my time was over, and he ran out of the room. And he's like, "Hey, listen, have you ever thought about, administrative leadership?" And I was like, "Oh no, my life is in the classroom, and this, that, and the other thing." And he's like, "I want you to think about being the dean of the college." And then he walked back into the room. And it just the idea was so big, right? It was such a vast, skylight of possibility. And I realized, years later, he had only known me for a very short period of time, and he saw leadership qualities in me. And it wasn't sort of the conventional, "Hey, you're a person of color. Can you do something with other people of color to make my life easier?" Right? It was, "Can you take a leadership role that will impact our entire community?" And whether I took it or not, the fact that this was the first time that anyone had ever even mentioned this to me, that they saw me as something other than a faculty of color, was remarkable to me. And so I just think about all the ways in which really well-intended colleagues just didn't see the leadership in me. And the ways in which it just took someone who knew that we are not going to get seen as leaders of a community by anyone other than ourselves sometimes. And so that's something that really struck me, because that changed my entire life's trajectory in important ways. I still feel like I'm an educator, but the platform that I have here and now is so different. He opened up my whole world with one question that no one even bothered to ever even ask. And so the ways in which we are kept in our place by people's assumptions and stereotypes about where we belong is why why we have hospitals full of medical doctors, of color, and not hospital boards, right? That's why we have faculty and teachers of color, but not administrators or board members. It's why we get to work, but we never get to own. Or how can we make our own bread if we can't be bakers, right? And so that's a really powerful way of keeping members of a society subjected to a second-class status, is to create really durable glass ceilings that they don't even notice, and that they internalize as their own incompetence, or their lack of skill, or their lack of knowledge, or their lack of readiness, and never wonder if this is actually one of the most effective ways of creating a subordinate caste of middle people. Alejandra?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, how do I follow that? No, just kidding. It's interesting because I think that maybe in a way I was fortunate, right? That I landed in a field where I'm the expected face of the field, right? I taught Latina writing, Spanish linguistics, right? And so nobody ever questioned, what is this Latina woman doing teaching this, right? However, I was once at a conversation with some of my colleagues, women faculty, and one of my colleagues, she's African American, and she's in the economics department, right? She's from the South. And she said, look, it never fails. I walk into the classroom and I am not the economist students expect to see, because I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I have a Southern accent, right? And so I think that that would be my, the way it's been. So it's been, I love what I do. I mean, I chose the field, but had I, like the doctors you mentioned, Khuram, right? If I had wanted to be a biochemist, right? Or a physicist, then it would have been a different story, right? Or if I had wanted to teach in those fields. So
yeah.
Yeah, so
And the stakes are much higher for people that don't have the privilege of being doctors, right? I mean, I think about my mother's 20 years at Walmart and being overlooked for any kind of like, management role or leadership role, right? And so, the ways in which this plays out for everyday people is really profound. And so when we look at the access to, basic opportunities, the American dream, if you will, the stakes go up even more in terms of what I see as this thick glass ceiling.
And yes, I think stereotypes, it's that it blocks others from seeing who we are, right? And you shared your story. I shared a little bit of my story in the academic setting and Khuram. And I guess my question, my point is, and in a way also connected to the book, right? The importance of telling our stories, right? If you want to comment on that, Khuram, right? The power of storytelling, right? The superpower, as Ali would say, right? And so, because that's what we're doing here, right? We're sharing stories, and I think that in a way, Sadia, is counteracting the stereotypes that are so restraining, right? And at the same time, to open up so that others can also see who we are. I mean, in sharing stories in general, as human beings, is we are storytellers. We always have been, right? But more than ever, I think, is the importance of that. So, Khuram, if you want to comment on that, my friend.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that there's something. I mean, I love stories. I'm a historian. I love hearing people's stories. If I, could have done this meeting differently, I would have had everyone go around and tell the story of how they got their name. I think that we all have really important stories to tell, not only because they connect us and they bind us because we see ourselves in other people's stories, right? And in so many ways, anyone that comes from an immigrant family anywhere in the world is going to relate to stories about what it means to become American, what it means to take certain kinds of practices and values, and then start to shift and adjust them, and the tensions that happen between different generations. And there's aspects of that we sometimes call universal. And I think that I would rather not use that language. Oh, this is the universal part of because then it makes it sound like, well, the other parts are like the weird, funny ethnic parts, right? And so instead of saying it's universal, just say what it is. These are the parts that I also connect to very deeply, right? And they evoke a deep connection. And then there's the parts that I remain really curious about, that I can't access, that are just outside of my reach, but that I know are so important to you and to your sense of what it means to be a human being. And I think that's the power of bearing witness to people's stories, is being able to be hit by the parts that we're hit by, and hold the parts that we don't fully understand, but we still honor the storyteller. And so when I tell stories about, how I have been, kind of overlooked, let's say, right? That was kind of the story I just told a second ago, that the response is, but yeah, well, you're fine now. Or, well, that's like, not that tragic. You seem like you're doing well. I think that we can project certain values and attitudes and assumptions onto people's stories because we do that. We all do that. And I think what takes a little bit more courage and a little bit more openness is just to hold those stories on those terms. And then I think something really wonderful happens, because in the architecture of that story, there's going to be furniture in some of those rooms that millions of other people have, that hundreds of thousands. So you're hearing one person's story, but it's rooted under the way that some trees are connected under the earth for like miles, right? The forests are connected as a single organism. Like, you're getting this tree of a story that's actually interconnected. And so there are aspects of my story that live in so many other places and spaces. And then we're getting an entry into that. So I think that's part of the power of stories. And also, it's a kind of unconditional love that we can give each other, and it doesn't cost us a dime. We just have to drop, we have to drop our assumptions and just pay attention and let a story in. And then, quite likely have our own story heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Khuram, thank you, my friend. I want to go back a little bit about higher education, right? And you mentioned the anecdote, that being recognized. But if you want to talk a little bit about your work, right, in terms of the students, and we have one of our wonderful students here, right? But the impact that students, have had, the impact that you think higher education, the way it's changing, right? The fact that we have, divisions now that are addressing diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? And as you pointed out, yet you are at another platform, but I know as a fact that you've also managed to connect to community activism, right? I'm thinking tools for social change and all the amazing work you did. So you've done it all, right? It's share that with us, because it is that presence in the classroom. As a student said, Professor Hussein is there teaching and learning. That's the constant, the dynamics in the classroom. Then as an administrator, right, at a higher, at a different, more solid platform or more impactful platform, and also your work in the community. And so how you've juggled all that, what a model.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the opportunities that being othered or always being seen as, like, explain yourself, explain how to say your name, where you're from. No, where are you really from? The Thousand Islands. No. Where are you really from, right? And like, your identity is constantly something that you're expected to answer for. And so your space in a community is kind of contingent, and that's hard, right? And what I think it offers a person and it offers the world is a revelation that all community really requires intentionality. That, we may happen to have the people around us, but that's proximity. That's not community. Just because you were born in the same town and that's your cousin doesn't mean it's a community, right? Mm-hmm. And we see that because when communities are tested, they show up differently than just people that are in proximity, right? The American project itself is being tested right now because who is America, right? People are losing faith in institutions, in politics. Partisanship has become vitriolic beyond measure, right? And part of that is there's not a sense of community. There's not a sense of the common. And I think that one of the great opportunities we have as people that have learned early that we have to figure this out if we're going to survive. We have to tell people how to say our names. We have to decide how we're going to be seen in the world. And we have to connect to communities intentionally and navigate and make intentional choices as you build skills. And more importantly, you build curiosity about how did this community get to be this way? Or is this even a community? Because maybe it just looks like one on the surface, but really these people don't even trust each other. And so I think about, work like tools for social change fundamentally for me is about, it's a school in a city, right? Those are all just proximities, right? How do people in Geneva feel about Hobart and William Smith? How does Hobart and William Smith feel about Geneva? How do we know where we are participating in real community? And there are moments where this becomes really clear. And I think you all can relate to this. Where a real test of community comes is when it hits the fan, right? When there's crisis or conflict or tragedy, right? Because then you have a moment where you have to try to resolve that conflict. And you either go into that conflict with a sense of like, we need to get back to who we are as a family, as a community, as friends, or you're like, wait, we're not family, we're not community, we're not friends. All we have is this conflict. And so, that becomes an inflection point for people that are in proximity. You can either take a moment of crisis like that, like the shooting death of an unarmed Black man in the city of Geneva for the first time in 200 years, and see that conflict as an opportunity, right? To say, who are we? How do we come back from this as a community? Or to just live in the conflict itself. Well, I think that this is what happened. These are the facts. And this is what happened. And these are the facts. And so what I was really interested in was this moment to say, how do we bring people into spaces using dialogue to start with, storytelling to start with, and then let's see where we can go. Let's see where we can get to. And it was humbling to see just the level of participation that Genevans of every color and creed, came out to be in these circles, to be in this space, to talk about what community meant to them. So to me, either a community that wanted to come back to being a community, or these were people in proximity that wanted to be in community beyond this crisis. And to me, that gave me a lot of hope in the possibility of how we participate, not just as an institution, but how we participate in like public life. Like, it doesn't have to be a blood sport. We don't always have to sort of look at each other as liberal or conservative, progressive, or far right. What we can also see is what we are invested in, what are our shared goods and needs and resources, who gets to participate, who doesn't. And we care because we care about the people. And, we can talk about all the great stuff we did on a civic level, the funds for, economic empowerment, electing the first Black city council person. But I think what's more important was the stories, right? The stories of a woman who, came into these circles saying, well, Geneva is such a lovely town. It's got vineyards and it's got these row houses and I just love it here. And then for that person to hear how other people had been pushed out of the corridor of visibility, out of the corridor of opportunity, out of even just the physical corridor of where cars and tourists get to go and where they don't get to go. And for her to say, I see you and I see your experience. And it's making me think differently about the community, not in an angry, hateful way, but just in a new way. It opened that up. So I think that that's also the power of stories, is if we can sit in community with those stories, then it raises the stakes for what we're willing to be doing as citizens, willing to vote for, what we're willing to organize for and lobby for and commission for, and all that kind of active civic engagement. I'm really also interested in what's underneath it. Who are we? Who is the public? What is the common? And so for me, I was like, this is what an education should do. It shouldn't just be locked up in this small liberal arts college and in classrooms. Education, as W.B. Du Bois says, is to draw forth human power, creative power. That's beautiful. And we all get to do that, right? We can do that today. We're doing it right now. So, I think that's as much as I will always remember about it is a work of shared education, shared community that can build towards a better world, a real community that can deal with some very hard conflicts. And there are some hard conflicts to deal with in the world.
Wow. Thank you, Khuram. Wow. So, so I think we need to open up a bit to questions. If, I have a couple more. I want to end up with hope. We'll come back to hope and maybe humor, but are there any questions in the chat?
The one in the chat first. So Meryl asks, when I was a teacher, a student taught me an important lesson. I called him out for disrespecting a disabled student. But Miss Nowak, if we don't diss George, how is he supposed to know we like him? Sadia said you not only taught, but you learned from your students. Do you remember an example like mine about inclusion?
I think that there's, it's a great kind of example of who sets the terms of community. And, I think that's part of what inclusion requires. Again, like other aspects of community, is intentionality, right? What are the things that we have that we can entrust with others about our story? Like, there are aspects of my identity that if a family member or someone close to me jokes about, I'll laugh right with them, right? And there's other aspects that if someone sort of brings up, I feel suddenly like really unsafe because I don't know what the plan is with that. And so I think it's a great example of students and teachers kind of working out that tension of what is and isn't, like, because I'd want to know, does this student feel like, do we have permission, right? And how do we know? Because the intent is there, right? The intent to be in community, to be playful, to connect. and that we don't want to look at disability and the ways in which people present as something to feel sorry about or to be, charitable about. That we all have our own ways of participating, and that part of what I think work towards like cripping, or even just like movements to call identities disabled or disabling. I think all of those are efforts to control the story. So I think that for that and for anything else, I just am really interested in who gets to be a part of telling the story about what is something that we can be playful about and disavow. And so that's, I know that's kind of a broad kind of frame. And I am thinking about what that means for me in the classroom. And, one of the things that comes up for me is the other part of that, which is our students being able to give us authentic feedback about how we're showing up for inclusion. I remember the first time a student told me, and I still keep in touch with her. She's like, I noticed that when you talk to male students in class, male identifying students, when they put up their hand for a question, you kind of just like say, yeah, okay. And then when female identifying students like say something, you always have like something to add on. I had never noticed this about myself in all the years I've been teaching. Now, there's a part of me that was wanted to say, oh no, that's because the female identifying students have more interesting things to say, right? Or to like defend or protect, versus just being really curious about where the student was coming from and their observations. And then thanking them for that, and honoring that they're seeing what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to participate. So I think for me, that's the part of the story that I find really interesting, is that the students felt open enough to share with the teacher, like, hey, this is how we're coming into this, and that the teacher like is sort of reflecting on that. And so I love and appreciate that part of it. But I would still want there to be more of that kind of storytelling from all of the students, including the disabled student. Yeah, I mean, I'm literally at a conference right now for how we teach democratic engagement in higher ed, and how we and every single person who has shared like challenges that they're seeing at their school. And these are schools all across the country. And they're all exactly what you just said. So in that story, in the story you just shared, is actually the architecture, like the furniture in that room is like IKEA furniture. It's like all over the world right now. And so, this distrust, this othering, I think that for me, something that's really, really important is for us to find spaces to cultivate skills, because no matter where somebody is coming from in terms of partisanship, everyone wants to feel heard, right? And so there's ways in which I think about the Marshall Rosenberg on nonviolent communication. And if you Google Marshall Rosenberg, you'll see he'll just put in needs list, and you'll see this rich list of needs. And I guarantee in any conflict or any difficult conversation, you can look at that list and say, this right now in this conflict, right? And you can also be really curious about what the other person might need. I think participating in those terms is a first and important step, is acknowledging that we all need something. And so it sort of, I think, creates a little bit more space. And the more we practice that, the more we stay in that environment of being oriented around what I need in order for this conversation to go well, what you need, and how can we meet each other's needs as we move forward, is a really fundamental part of it. And also, I hear you about like the group. It's like something that a dear friend of mine would often say about our work in the community. Like, yeah, we're preaching to the choir. And choir needs practice, right? And we are not necessarily free of our own kinds of attitudes and assumptions and biases, and also approach. Like sometimes we get really indignant about a bigoted view, And then we'll use an approach that's actually really harmful or othering or humiliating or judgment like driven. A lot of my early activism was in kind of what is seen as sort of really confrontational politics of like, calling to the carpet an elected official and having hundreds of people make demands in these. And I'm not saying that there isn't some impact from that. But what I also know is if that's the only way they were ever willing to show up in each other's lives is like, I am going to use the force and power I have to compel you to think and behave differently. If we stay in that force model, then, that force model could be flipped. We might have the power one day, and then those who have the opposing kind of ideology will have it the next. What if there's a third way? And I think that within, a lot of American traditions, within Quaker circles, within the Haudenosaunee talking circles, restorative practices that are alive and well in the Finger Lakes, I think we have models for how to participate in nonviolent communication that's humanizing and empowering, and that doesn't lead us to like this zero-sum game where we have to win. What if we didn't have to win? What if we just had to connect? And so I know that that's hard, which is why we need each other to do it. And also, I would say we still need to honor that, for me to be able to participate, I need people to know my story. I need to know that we're not just in this like kind of colorblind version of restorative practices, that we're understanding that people of color, that women, that people with disabilities, that people that identify as transgender or are transgender or gender nonconforming, that all of the identities that we bring in to these spaces are part of it. And so we want to be able to honor people's stories and lived experiences when we come into those communities. And honestly, even in a community where people agree on a lot, they might not agree on the how they want to participate and listen to each other. And so I think practice. I practice. I want to practice more, and I want to be in community more to practice, because I have so much yet to learn. Every time I have an argument with a family member, like during a holiday, I'm reminded how quickly I forget. Right? Not to take the bait and fall. And I did big time a couple weeks ago at the end of Ramadan for Eid al-Fitr. Oh my goodness. It was not good. And it was not my proudest moment. But I forgot all these lessons, all these skills went out the window because I needed to win for social justice. I needed to make this point. Right? But what's the point when you're not even seeing the other person? Wow. Wow, that's big. That's big. That's an abundant question, right? And I mean, so much of it is, I think, captured for me in, and even like a genuine acceptance of that premise, right? Like, when you read the Enlightenment philosophers, it's not the humanity and the humanitarianism that critical race theorists object to. It's the fact that when they mean human, they mean white people. They mean white men, right? That's the part. Like, it's not that, they don't like Kant and all these like, wonderful, thinkers were wrong, but it was like, who are they thinking of? And so I think for me, an American dream is one, and I think we have this capacity. I think we have tried again and again to have this, is to repair and to stay in a state of repair again and again and again. To stitch up the broken things. And I think in the reparation, we will find ourselves anew. We will find ourselves more beautiful, more powerful, more effective, and more strong as a multiracial democracy than anywhere else in the world. We have that capacity. When the field marshal order came from Sherman, 40 acres and a mule, if we had just kept that promise, right, and just held to the reparation, if we had held to that radical era of Reconstruction, one person, one vote, at the time, one man, one vote, and allowed Black Americans to elect those they chose. When we invite communities to participate with their skill into this country, to give them the dignities and rights that are available to all. right? And to do so in an intentional way, knowing that we won't do it if we just say we're doing all, right? We have to be specific, that these are the reparative measures we will use to address the inequalities experienced by Asian Americans in the Asian Exclusionary Act, right? The Mexican Americans that had land taken from them in 1840, Black Americans. And I know we oftentimes think of this as a zero-sum game. And I remember I was doing a dialogue once and someone said, what do you want from me? Do you want me to like give up my house, sell my house and give it to Black people? And the response was, you won't even give up your imagination. Why are you talking about your mortgage? We are not willing to give up on the idea that it's a zero-sum game and see what else emerges. Heather McGhee wrote this really powerful book called The Sum of Us, where she shows that the American dream has been compromised for more white people than for Black people because of racism. That by the numbers, white Americans have lost healthcare, public pools, good schools, good roads because of racism. And that more white people by the numbers have actually been harmed and lost out on the American dream because we've allowed subprime mortgage lenders to target poor Black and brown communities. They eventually target larger pools of vulnerable white communities, right? Every time we fail to take something like the Green New Deal and think this is a way for us to all participate in a healthier, more inclusive economy. And I'm not like saying that's the answer, but I'm just giving an example. Every time we do that, every time we don't allow our imaginations to believe that sharing is something that is actually possible and that there is a common good and a common outcome, then we ultimately all lose. The majority of Americans lose out on the American dream when we think it's a zero-sum game. And that's what's happened again and again. Look at what residential segregation and suburbanization has done to our beautiful cities, right? These cities were imperial in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They had everything you needed. They looked like they were from the future, but we said they were only for some people and only in some parts, right? And then we did the same with the suburbs. And every part of American life is now crumbling, including our institutions. Yet we are the wealthiest country on earth. But this is the cost of not sharing. And so my American dream is one where we actually believe in a public, believe in a common, believe in an us, and believe in sharing as the ultimate achievement for access and democracy.
This is going to sound super transactional and not very inspiring, but I promise you it is. I think it's inspiring. I want to read books written by women of color. I think that we are at a species inflection point. And I think the if I can be extremely kind of generalized without getting into identity politics, I think for a lot of reason, women of color around the world are able to speak to any issue that I have alive in my life and that anyone else does. As Angela Davis said, women didn't get the right to vote at the turn of the century. They got the right to vote when Black women got the right to vote, right? And that the vision for inclusion that Black women and women of color have for our world is so important. They are literate in a way that I just cannot be, because there's so many places I just don't think of. And I think of all my great mentors. I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for women of color. From my mother to my first professor that saw me as something more than those that told me that I was never going to be more than what I was right now. And so I would say, I want you to write the book, Sadia. And I want you to seek out authors. I want all of us to seek out women of color, because our stories are in there. And there's so many stories that we just will not be thinking about until we read theirs.
What a beautiful comeback. I love it. So I think
I think that this has been true for a lot of folks. I think for the last few years, is that they have been deeply disappointed by the failure of public leaders to articulate a view of America that reflects core values that are fundamental to a democracy, and that feel like exercises of power and partisan influence. And part of it is, I think, an opportunity to welcome ourselves into a world that so many of us have lived in for centuries. So many of us have looked at presidential speeches for years, knowing that we could see the fault lines in the sweeping stories about the war on terror. And I could see the fault lines in the ways in which people were talking about safety and security in the American way, right? Just like Black Americans could see the fault line when politicians talked in the 60s about law and order, and we saw federal agents being deployed against people. You know, I was in New York City, I was in Brooklyn, when those grand speeches about safety and keeping Americans safe was translated. And what it looked like in Brooklyn was these vibrant, beautiful Pakistani neighborhoods were cleared out. People were disappeared in the fog of night. And people were terrified to speak up or say anything. Homes and shops were ransacked. People lived in absolute terror. If it was a war on terror, you couldn't tell it in Brooklyn, because all there was terror. And so I would say the first thing that we have is an opportunity in this moment where more and more of us are seeing an incongruity between what many are saying is the problem versus what is actually happening on the ground, to be in community with those that have been surviving these conditions for generations. And they've been surviving them with humor, with art, with love, with the everyday things that we can do, with the poetry and the creative energy that we can take and make in our own lives. So I think, again, like, listen to Black women, right? Listen and study, Toni Morrison as a student would study a civics textbook about how to be in strange times when the promise of democracy is not looking like it's actually of any interest to some that seem to have power. So that's one thing that I would say, is that this is an opportunity to learn from the scholars of oppression, people that have their PhD in struggle and that have learned, right? Literal art forms like blues music, jazz, right? All of it, hip hop, coming out of struggle, but never losing love. And that's the other thing that I think we have to learn. And this is why I think it's important that language of people of color came out of Asian women and Black women coming together, is they loved each other, right? Because as Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So I would say that at a time like this, instead of like looking at these efforts to silence DEI or wokeism or whatever on earth is happening as like a crumbling of American democracy or hating the people that are doing it, is to actually maintain, sustain, and grow the skill of love, the art of loving in public, right? Loving a public, and to learn from people, because it takes a lot of love to believe in democracy right now. It takes a lot of love to believe in community right now. Yet we see that just like springtime, it just kind of happens, or at least on the surface. I'm looking at my arborist tree expert, right? As you're going to tell me, no, it's been happening for weeks, right? It's been right under the bark. It's been right under the branch. It's been right under the dirt, brown, dark, frozen earth. Under there, magic is happening. The civil rights movement is impossible to think of as something that happened in the 60s because it took 100 years. If you look at the Supreme Court cases, they go back to 1840. That's 160 or 14 years before Brown versus Board of Education, right? And it'll be almost 100 more years of legislative efforts, right? So it's a river of struggle. It's a beautiful struggle. We get to be part of it. And so I think learn from scholars that have learned the art of maintaining our humanity, our dignity, our style in times of absolute strangeness and at times of absolute kind of counter democratic efforts by those, because we need them. Because if we don't do that, and we have to do it in community, we have to do it in spaces like this, because if we try to do it on our own, it's too much to carry, and we'll carry it here. And there's a reason art and music is such a big part of it. There's a reason dance is such a big part of it. It's the reason they sang on those marches, right? There's a reason that the Black Panthers had so much damn style and swagger, right? Like, we have got to live it in our bodies, and we've got to let it be a part of who we want to live like. And I'll like leave that to people in different communities to decide what that feels like, what feels right in any given community. But I think we have to live our love for the public, live our love for the public good, live our love for justice in spite and in the face of it, right? It's what Jesse Owens was told when he was told before, when you run in these Olympics, you must first learn to close out the noise, right? And remember who you are. And that's what this moment also is to not get doom scrolling and just spend all of our time like looking at quotes of DeSantis and like just getting angry and thinking, what's the future of democracy? But to run, baby, run, right? Close out the noise, remember who we are, love the power of it, because it is under the surface, and there will be a springtime, right? This is Victor Hume. The world cannot stop an idea whose time has arrived. And so there will be a moment where this will need to resurface, right? Because ultimately this is reactionary politics. It doesn't have a point of view. It's just saying no to things. It doesn't have the capacity to sustain a society or a community, right? But we do. We who love systems that serve all people, taxes that serve all people, access points for every member of our society, right? We that love the public, that love the sharing public, we have a point of view. Everyone on this call, I guarantee, has a point of view, and we should be singing it.
Wow, it's getting harder and harder to follow. Wow, your act, but I don't know how we're doing with time, Alex. You can. But what I wanted to, and maybe if it's time to close, you'll tell me, Alex. But I'm thinking of the tree and the soil, and but I'm also thinking of the sky, right? And hoping Sadia can also join us. But I think the sky is the space for hope, right? And I know, Khuram, you and I have had conversations about hope, and I know that in the book that we read, the last chapter is invest in hope, but tie your camel first, right? And so it's so if you want to share with us, and Sadia, if you're able to share, because I think that sometimes younger generations.
I'm here.
yeah, but I know, but I'm hoping that you're not muffled, right? So that your take on hope, right? Because I know that in certain activist circles is. Some people say, hey, first action and then hope will come, right? What do we do with hope? Because I think it's powerful. I think it's been misunderstood, right? I think it's the tree is the sky, right? We're growing, we're just reaching out to that. So if you want to comment on that, in Sadia, if your voice is not muffled, my friend, I would welcome your perspective on hope.
So it's such a beautiful meditation. I would love, actually, if we have time, to hear from others about what their practice of hope is, because I think about hope as a practice, as something we do. It's something intentional. It's like every time we go through a struggle or a painful moment in our life, it's like what shows up is that good inner voice. And as a father of 3 young boys, I'm oftentimes thinking about just saying things that, become their self-talk, like voices that they have that they're in company with, because there are always going to be those painful voices. Some of those are our own, some of those have infiltrated from outside. And so I think practicing a kind of affirmation, right? I think Adrienne Marie Brown has this really great workbook for like practices of self-love and hope and community love, which I would recommend, just because it's nice to actually see like practices, and so I would love to know what other people practice when they think about hope. I have like a list of quotes from people like Cornel West and Adrienne Marie Brown and others that I just sort of like keep around. So I remember that that struggle and pain are actually so fundamental to the human experience, and they're so beautiful because they connect us to so many other members of our human family, and that they allow us to grow in a way that nothing else does, and they allow us to heal. The scars on my body are stronger than any other skin on my body. And, there's a way in which the political body needs constant douses of hope, right? That the civic body needs that hope, that practice of hope. And for me, that hope means staying really comfortable in my discomfort and trying to walk towards other people's stories with struggle and intentionality and a desire to better learn and understand. And that we don't always have all the answers. I mean, when I think about those moments like, recently, going back to the book here a little bit and not having a place, right? Talking to these two transgender, transitioning one and transgender young people about a conflict where, it's a white woman and a woman of color, and the white woman saying, well, you need to sort of give up your family because they're not seeing you for who you are, for your humanity. And the struggle I think I was trying to name for her was, I know this is hard for you because your family has disregarded you in terms of your identity, and it's safer for you to leave them. But for her, she is also the child of immigrants who have survived together. And so she can't separate her identity as an immigrant, as a South Asian, from her identity as transgender. Both of those are essential to her. And part of what's difficult is sometimes we don't have the solution for people. We just have to sit with them. I've been thinking a lot about compassion and compass, and to encompass, and that maybe compassion sometimes is just about encompassing, just surrounding someone, just a hug of witnessing and seeing them and recognizing, acknowledging them, even if we can't understand their struggle. And the immigrant struggle is going to be unique. And depending on who we're talking about, the South Asian struggle is going to be unique. And so if we want to be in community with diverse members of our world, we have to start with compassion. We have to start with comfort in our discomfort. And we've got to practice something affirming. I am not against people that talk in the mirror and say something really positive before they go into a really difficult place, because I think it's really important to remember who we are and what we're proud of about ourselves and what's beautiful about ourselves. That I don't think that's selfish. I don't think that's self-involved. I think we have to offer ourselves that basic degree of recognition so that we can maintain that practice of hope. And the last thing, and this is why I want to ask other people, is we have got to hear how other people are practicing hope so we can steal their ideas and we can use those in our own life and in our own community, and we can honor those practices. So I don't know if we have time. I'd love at least one person to share your practice of hope. How do you keep hope in times of division, hatred, bigotry, silencing of free thought, and greater partisanship?
So Cindy's here trying to show something.
Yeah, can you see
let's see here.
Can you see that?
It might be backwards for you.
Have open hearts.
Okay, so I took the word hope and I took the H and added AVE to make the word have, and then OPE, the rest of hope, and then added hearts and minds. And to me, that to have hope is to have open hearts and open minds. So it's like kind of like an acronym, but it works for me. I want to just share one other little thing that you were talking about, listening to the stories of Black women. And I don't know if it was an interview with Ali or the author of the book we read, or it was in his book, but I copied this down and sent it to my granddaughter, who's a singer-songwriter in Nashville. And this is Toni Morrison's quote: "The creative process is most exciting in the imagination. It begins as something, but then it grows and grows." And I think of this in terms of so much of what we're talking about. In his case, he had written the play Domestic Crusaders, and she commented, she saw his play, which was about one day in the life of a Muslim family, and how it was just ordinary. They were discussing ordinary things, and she was raving about it. And he really latched onto this, and it helped him become more creative. But I just thought that was quite fitting too. But thank you so much for. I took about 10 pages of notes from your sharing today, so I'm going to go and decipher them now. Thank you.
I love that, and I hope if you can drop that quote in the chat, because I want to let that grow. I remember, I was a school teacher after 9/11, and for me, it was an incredibly painful moment, because even like we were so close to the school was so close to the Twin Towers that the ash from the towers billowed in, and jet fighters were flying above, and so we felt like this moment of absolute fear. But I'll never forget that at the exact moment that I was afraid from outside of whoever or whatever this was, I was also afraid of the people around me. And so when it comes, because I didn't know, because I had seen what happened after Oklahoma City, I had seen the kind of like ways in which people's civil rights were secretly being sort of taken away based on their religious and ethnic background. And then after the first World Trade Center attack, the same kind of ethnic violence that happened. And so how do you survive that level of being torn in half? Right. And so it's hope. Right. And this is where the creative process is so important. It was so important for me, is I was able as an educator to create a different space in my classrooms. Right. And I remember I only found this out because there was a documentary made about my school, because it was so it had been so impacted. People had died and lost family. And there was a student, and I didn't even have her as a student. And I remember she said in the documentary, she's like, I was so angry and I had so much hate towards Muslims. And then I heard Mr. Hussein talk, and it just brought me into myself. And I remembered you have to see people for who they are. I don't think I said anything particularly special, but I think that it was so important for me to be in a community and to be an educator and a learner in a community where we could imagine something different, where we could talk about our feelings and our experiences, and we could try to see each other. And so I have lived the power of hope, because those years were really painful years. I think they will probably always be my darkest days. The things that I witnessed, the harm that I saw, the dehumanization, the death tolls in America and abroad, the tortures, the disappearances, the broken families, all in the name of freedom and liberty. That was the extra on top of it. And yet I stand before you still a believer in hope. And so to say that imagination is some fluffy doodah thing, I mean, I think that is a profound misunderstanding of what's actually happening, what is being allowed to grow under the frozen earth when we imagine, and when we imagine together. So I am so grateful that I got to imagine together with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everybody who came, the coalition. I just want to add that it is in, forums like this one where the stories are heard. So when we were talking about how do we promote the sharing of our stories, the coalition has been doing an amazing job, right? It's reading books, it's bringing people from the community to share their stories. So I want to thank the coalition, and thank you, Sadia, for coming and supporting. And Khuram, what can I say, my friend? I told everybody you are in for a treat. And we
You are all beautiful people, but I have to tell you how lucky we are to have Alejandra in this community. Talk about somebody who can hold a public sense of love in this deeply, personal way. I know we shouldn't mimic or try to imitate other people, but if I could be Alejandra for a day.
If I could be Khuram for a day, that would be perfect. And we'll come back to the group. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's time to push that button that says leave, but we're not really leaving. We're staying in a way. So